The countryside house loomed ahead, its weathered stone walls and ivy-clad facade glowing faintly in the late afternoon sun. The air smelled of damp earth and wildflowers, but there was an almost imperceptible chill that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I carried my small bag across the creaking wooden porch, the boards groaning under each step as if whispering secrets I couldn't yet understand. Grandpa greeted me at the door with his familiar warm smile, his eyes twinkling with the gentle kindness I remembered from childhood visits. His arms wrapped me in a comforting hug, the scent of his cologne and old books mingling with the faint aroma of wood smoke from the fireplace. "You're here at last," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that eased some of my unease. Inside, the house felt alive in a way that was both comforting and strange. Sunlight filtered through tall, dusty windows, casting long, shifting patterns on the wooden floor. Yet as I glanced at the shadows, they seemed to linger longer than natural, stretching unnaturally along the walls. Something about the place felt off, though I couldn't put my finger on it. Grandpa led me to my room, a cozy space lined with faded wallpaper and old photographs of family gatherings. Everything appeared normal, a home frozen in time. Still, the faint, inexplicable chill in the corners of the room whispered that tonight, the ordinary would give way to something far more unsettling. As the day faded, the house seemed to sigh around me, settling into an eerie quiet. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and I felt a shiver that wasn't just from the autumn air. I couldn't shake the feeling that this visit would be different from all the others, that behind Grandpa's warm smile, a secret was waiting, and it would reveal itself when the night fell. Night fell quickly over the countryside, swallowing the house in a blanket of darkness. I lay in bed, the soft rustling of leaves outside mingling with the distant hoot of an owl. At first the quiet was soothing, but then I noticed it. Faint whispers, almost too soft to catch, seeming to drift from the corners of the room. I froze, straining my ears, but the sound vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The shadows cast by the flickering candlelight seemed alive, stretching and twisting along the walls in impossible ways. A chair that had been tucked neatly against the table now seemed slightly askew, as though nudged by an unseen hand. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, the familiar anxiety of sleeping in a new place playing tricks on me. Then, I caught Grandpa's eyes in the dim light. Sitting in the rocking chair by the fireplace, he looked different. There was a glint in them, sharp and cold, that I had never seen before. The warmth of his daytime smile was gone, replaced by something harder, almost predatory. My heart pounded, a pit forming in my stomach. But when I blinked, his gaze softened again, and he smiled gently as if nothing had happened. I pulled the blankets closer around me, listening to the house settle. Every creak, every sigh of the floorboards sounded amplified in the silence. Something was stirring in the corners of the room, something I couldn't see but could feel pressing against the edges of my consciousness. I realized with a cold twist of fear that this night was only the beginning, that Grandpa, or perhaps the house itself, held secrets that would not stay hidden for long. The whispers returned, clearer now, carrying syllables I didn't recognize. My pulse raced as I strained to understand, but the meaning remained just beyond reach. Sleep, I realized, would be impossible tonight, and perhaps for many nights to come. The next morning, sunlight poured through the tall windows, but it did little to erase the uneasy feeling that clung to the house. I wandered into Grandpa's study, a room I had always loved for its dusty shelves and the scent of old books. But today my eyes were drawn to the walls. Scratched into the faded wallpaper were symbols I had never seen before. Jagged lines, looping spirals, and shapes that seemed almost alive, as if they shifted when I looked away. Some were small, subtle, barely noticeable, while others were bold and deliberate, carved deep into the wood beneath the paper. My stomach twisted as I traced them with my fingers, feeling a strange vibration under my touch, like the symbols themselves were resonating with something hidden in the house. I called out to Grandpa, hoping he would laugh it off. "Grandpa, what are these?" He froze for a moment, his hand lingering over a stack of papers. Then he gave a small, almost too calm chuckle. "Oh, those old things? Just doodles from long ago. Nothing to worry about." But his eyes flicked nervously to the corners of the room, and I saw a flicker of something he couldn't hide. Fear. My unease deepened. There was no warmth in the excuse, only an edge that hinted at secrets buried far deeper than Grandpa was willing to reveal. I spent the rest of the morning examining the study, noticing that the symbols seemed to form patterns almost like a code. Some spirals were connected by faint lines like a map of something unknown. The air in the room felt heavier, almost charged, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. By the time I left the study, I couldn't shake the sense that the symbols weren't just random, that they were warnings, or perhaps a binding, something to contain what lurked in the shadows of the house. I glanced back at Grandpa, who had resumed reading quietly, his calm demeanor a fragile mask over the secrets I was beginning to glimpse. That night, as I lay in bed, the symbols from the study seemed to echo in my mind, their jagged forms twisting behind my eyelids. The house had grown darker somehow, not just outside, but inside me, and I realized that whatever was hidden here had been waiting for me to notice. That night, sleep came reluctantly. The house was quieter than before, but the silence was oppressive, pressing against my ears until I could hear every subtle creak and groan. Around midnight, I woke to the faintest sound, a low murmur, almost melodic, coming from Grandpa's room. I sat up, heart hammering, listening. The words were unmistakably human, yet I couldn't understand a single syllable. The tone twisted strangely, rising and falling in ways that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. There was an ancient cadence to it, like a language that had not been spoken in centuries. Curiosity and dread warred inside me, and I crept toward the room. The door was slightly ajar, the warm glow of a lamp spilling into the hallway. Through the gap, I could see Grandpa seated in his chair, eyes half closed, lips moving in a whisper that sent shivers down my spine. His hands twitched in patterns I didn't recognize, tracing shapes in the air as if he were drawing invisible symbols. A sudden cold wind swept through the hallway, though all the windows were shut. I shivered and stepped back, suddenly aware that whatever was happening in that room wasn't just Grandpa talking in his sleep. There was intent behind it, a deliberate rhythm to the murmur, as if he were negotiating with something unseen. The whispers grew louder for a brief moment, then abruptly stopped. Grandpa's eyes opened and he glanced at me, warm and familiar again, yet tinged with exhaustion, as though he had been battling a weight I couldn't even imagine. "Go back to sleep," he murmured, voice soft, almost pleading. "It's nothing, just nothing." I wanted to believe him, but the feeling of dread lingered, crawling into my chest and tightening with each heartbeat. The language, the strange movements, the sudden chill. It wasn't just sleep talking. Something ancient and unknowable stirred in the house, and Grandpa's nightly murmurs were only the beginning. Lying back in bed, I stared at the ceiling, haunted by the cadence of those unfamiliar tongues. My dreams that night were restless, filled with swirling shadows and echoes of words I couldn't understand. And I realized with a sinking certainty, whatever Grandpa was speaking to, it had been waiting for me to hear it. A few nights later, sleep eluded me once again. The whispers had grown more insistent, tugging at the edges of my mind, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed thicker, darker. I rose quietly and wandered the hallway, drawn inexplicably toward the large mirror in the living room. At first, everything seemed normal. My reflection stared back, pale and wide-eyed. bathed in the dim glow of the moonlight filtering through the curtains. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Across the glass, behind my own face, another figure shimmered. Grandpa standing perfectly still, but his reflection was wrong. His eyes glinted with an unnatural light, and his smile was twisted, sharp at the edges, almost predatory. For a heartbeat, it wasn't my grandpa at all. It was something else. Something that had been lurking behind the familiar warmth, biding its time. His shadow in the mirror seemed to move independently, curling and stretching while the real grandpa sat quietly in his chair, reading a book as if nothing were amiss. I stepped closer, heart pounding, and the reflection mimicked my movements with a deliberate delay as though mocking me. The room felt colder now, and the faint metallic tang I had begun to notice in the air grew stronger. I stumbled back, tripping over the edge of the rug, and the reflection grinned wider, vanishing only as I blinked. Shaken, I returned to my room, but sleep offered no solace. The image lingered in my mind, a grandpa who wasn't entirely him trapped in the glass, a silent warning of something lurking beneath the surface of his gentle exterior. That night I realized the house held more than just memories and shadows. It held a presence, watching, waiting, and the mirror had given me the first glimpse of what had been hiding in plain sight. By the time morning came, the sunlight seemed too weak to chase away the dread. I avoided the mirror entirely, but the image stayed with me, a persistent reminder that what I knew as Grandpa might not be the same person I had thought all these years. The next day, still shaken by the reflection in the mirror, I decided to explore the attic, a place I had always found fascinating as a child, filled with forgotten trunks and dusty relics of the past. Sunlight spilled weakly through the small window, illuminating layers of dust that danced like tiny specters in the air. As I rifled through old boxes, I stumbled upon stacks of yellowed letters, brittle photographs, and journals bound with fraying leather. At first they seemed like the usual remnants of a family's history, but as I examined them, a darker story began to emerge. Names of relatives I had never met appeared, alongside strange notations about disappearances, illnesses, and unexplained deaths. Some entries mentioned cryptic warnings, ominous phrases scribbled in the margins, and references to the nights, and always capitalized, always foreboding. One photograph in particular caught my attention. A family gathering from decades ago, yet everyone's faces looked tense, almost fearful, except Grandpa. His eyes, even in the faded image, held that same unsettling glint I had glimpsed in the mirror. Behind him, in the shadowed corners of the photo, I thought I could make out figures that didn't belong, blurred shapes, almost like shadows frozen in mid-movement. A journal revealed the darkest secret of all. Grandpa had been aware of a presence in the house for as long as anyone could remember, documenting strange occurrences, nightly disturbances, and rituals meant to contain something malevolent. The more I read, the more I realized that the house itself was a vessel for secrets and horrors carefully hidden for generations. As I sat amidst the papers, a cold draft swept through the attic, carrying the faint metallic tang that had been haunting me since my arrival. I shivered, suddenly aware that the past wasn't just history. It was alive, bleeding into the present, and that the knowledge I had uncovered might make me a part of the story whether I wanted to be or not. By the time I descended from the attic, clutching the letters and photographs, I felt the weight of the family's hidden history pressing down on me. Grandpa's warm smile from the morning seemed like a fragile mask, hiding decades of secrets that had festered in the shadows. Secrets that were now mine to bear. That night, sleep came reluctantly. The house seemed quieter than usual, but the stillness carried a tense energy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I lay in bed staring at the shadows that stretched across the ceiling when I heard it. The faintest scrape, like something being nudged along the floor. I froze. The sound came again, this time closer, a rhythmic tapping that echoed unnervingly through the hall. Heart pounding, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and crept toward the source. In the dim moonlight filtering through the curtains, I saw the small wooden chair in the corner shift slightly. Though there was no wind and no one else in the room, a stack of books on the table toppled over without warning, scattering pages across the floor. I rushed forward to pick them up, my hands trembling, but as soon as I touched them, they seemed heavier than they should be, as if something invisible were pressing down. The phenomena escalated. A vase rattled violently, then tipped, crashing to the floor in shards. Curtains swayed through the windows were closed. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway ticked erratically, its pendulum jerking back and forth in unnatural patterns. Every object seemed alive, responding to an unseen presence, and the familiar comfort of the house had evaporated entirely. I caught sight of Grandpa sitting in his chair as if nothing had happened. His eyes, however, flicked toward the chaos with a brief, unreadable intensity. A shiver ran down my spine. Was he controlling this? Or was he just another witness to something far older and far darker than either of us? That night I slept fitfully, one ear attuned to every creak, every whisper, every movement. The house had transformed from a safe haven into a living entity, and I understood with dawning horror that nothing within it was stationary or predictable. Whatever resided here was testing boundaries, testing me, and it was growing bolder by the hour. It happened late that night, just as the wind howled against the old wooden shutters. I had been lying awake, eyes wide, when a strange sound drew me from my bed, a low, guttural murmur unlike anything I had ever heard. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept toward Grandpa's room, every instinct screaming that I shouldn't, yet unable to resist. Through the half-open door I saw him. At first he looked as he always did, sitting in his chair with his head bowed. But then his hands began to twitch violently, fingers contorting in unnatural ways. His back arched slightly and a deep, almost inhuman groan escaped him. I froze, unable to move as the room seemed to darken around him. His skin, faintly illuminated by the moonlight, began to ripple, as though something beneath it was moving of its own accord. A shadow flickered across his face, twisting his features into something monstrous, something that was both him and yet not him. His eyes, once gentle and warm, glowed with a cold, predatory light. I wanted to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. The air grew thick and metallic, the scent of blood faint but unmistakable. Grandpa's voice, or what came out of his mouth, was no longer familiar. It was layered with a deep, resonant echo, as if multiple entities spoke through him at once. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the transformation ended. Grandpa slumped forward, exhausted, his eyes returning to their human warmth. He looked at me with a weary, apologetic expression. "Go back to bed," he murmured, voice trembling. "You shouldn't have seen that." I stumbled back to my room, heart racing, mind reeling. That night, sleep offered no comfort. The image of Grandpa's twisted reflection, the unnatural movements, the glowing eyes, they burned into my memory. I realized with a chilling certainty, the man I had always known was fighting something far older, far more terrifying than I could comprehend, and I was now painfully aware of the stakes. The house was no longer just a home. It was a battleground, and Grandpa's nightly transformations were only the beginning of a horror that had waited for me to arrive. After witnessing Grandpa's first transformation, sleep became a battleground in itself. Every time I closed my eyes, shadows crept into my dreams, taking on shapes and forms I had seen in the house. At first it was subtle, a whisper here, a flicker of movement there, but soon, the nightmares began to mirror reality in ways that made my waking hours feel just as uncertain. I dreamed of the hallway stretching endlessly, doors appearing where none existed, and the creaking floorboards groaning under invisible footsteps. When I woke, the house had shifted slightly. The hall rug was wrinkled in the same way. A chair was slightly out of place, or a book lay open on the floor as it had in the dream. It was impossible to tell where the nightmare ended and the waking world began. Grandpa's room became a recurring focus. In my dreams, he was no longer himself, his features twisting into monstrous forms, yet he seemed aware of me, as if trying to communicate something urgent without speaking. Often I would wake in the exact position my dream self had been in, heart pounding, drenched in sweat, staring at the ceiling of my real room. The whispers followed me into the night. Sometimes I could almost hear them through the walls, echoing words from the dreams I had just experienced. Objects shifted just as they had in my sleep, creating a dizzying loop of illusion and reality. I began to question everything: the warmth of the sunlight, the solidity of the furniture, even the memory of Grandpa as the kind, gentle man I had arrived to visit. By the third night, the blending of nightmare and reality left me exhausted and disoriented. I caught glimpses of shadowy figures in my peripheral vision during the day, echoes of my dreams playing out in the world around me. The house no longer felt safe. It had become a living extension of the nightmares, and I realized with a creeping horror that my mind was no longer separate from whatever force had haunted Grandpa for decades. That night, I resolved to understand the truth behind the dreams. If the nightmares were bleeding into reality, then the house and Grandpa were hiding something far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. And I was no longer just a visitor. I was a participant in whatever dark game had been set into motion long before I arrived. The following day, driven by the merging of nightmares and reality, I returned to the attic, determined to uncover more of Grandpa's secrets. Amid the dusty trunks and stacks of forgotten belongings, I found a small, leather-bound diary tucked behind a row of old books, hidden so carefully it seemed almost sacred. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed and brittle, but the writing inside was meticulous, each word etched with urgency and care. As I flipped through the pages, the diary revealed a side of Grandpa I had never known. He chronicled nightly struggles with a malevolent entity, describing its movements, whispers, and attempts to seep into the family over generations. Each entry detailed rituals he performed to keep it at bay, symbols drawn in secrecy, chants whispered under his breath, and sacrifices of his own sleep and energy to maintain the fragile barrier. Some pages contained sketches, jagged shapes, intricate patterns, and symbols that matched the ones I had seen scratched into the study walls. Beside them were notes written in the same unfamiliar language Grandpa had murmured in his sleep, now forming a coherent pattern I could just barely decipher. The diary suggested that these were not just random scribbles. They were protective wards, a code to bind the entity within the house, and perhaps within Grandpa himself. One entry chilled me to the core. It hinted that the entity was patient, cunning, and capable of choosing a new host if the barrier weakened. Grandpa had been fighting alone for decades, and each night of his life was a battle the rest of the family remained blissfully unaware of. The realization struck me. My arrival had coincided with a period of weakening, and I had unknowingly stepped into a war that had been waged long before my time. As I sat in the attic, clutching the diary, a cold draft swept across the floor, carrying with it the faint metallic tang I had come to associate with the presence. The whispers seemed to echo faintly from the pages themselves, as if the diary were alive, warning me, urging caution. I realized then that the diary was more than a record. It was a guide, a map of the horrors lurking in the house, and possibly the only chance I had to understand what Grandpa had been protecting. That night, I placed the diary carefully under my pillow. Sleep came reluctantly, and when it did, it brought visions of the entity, of the battles Grandpa had fought, and of a darkness that was far from defeated. The hidden diary had revealed the truth, but it had also revealed my new role, to witness, to learn, and perhaps to continue the fight that Grandpa had begun long before I was born. The night after discovering the diary, a tense stillness settled over the house. I could feel it in my bones, a weight pressing down, heavy and suffocating, as if the house itself was aware of my newfound knowledge. I barely slept, and when I did, dreams of shadowed corridors and twisted shapes clawed at my mind. Around midnight, I awoke to a faint scratching sound on the wall across from my bed. I squinted in the darkness and saw something that made my blood run cold. Symbols, new ones glowing faintly, etched into the plaster as if by an invisible hand. Among the twisting lines, I could just make out words written in the same strange language Grandpa had murmured in his sleep. The message was clear, though I barely understood the syntax. Beware, it chooses anew. Panic surged through me. The entity wasn't confined anymore. It could move, adapt, and, worst of all, it could choose a host. I glanced toward Grandpa's room, but the door was closed and the warm glow from inside seemed deceptively normal. The sense of imminent danger was palpable. The house itself felt alive, whispering warnings that I didn't yet fully comprehend. I ran to the study, clutching the hidden diary, flipping frantically through the pages for guidance. The writings confirmed my fear. The entity's patience was limitless, and any weakness could be fatal. Grandpa had kept it at bay for decades. But now, with the barrier slightly frayed, the entity had begun testing its reach, probing for vulnerabilities. The metallic tang in the air thickened and a shiver ran down my spine. Shadows in the corners seemed to twitch with intention, and faint whispers carried through the house like echoes of the warning. It chooses anew. It chooses anew. I realized then that this was no longer just Grandpa's battle. It was ours. And if I wasn't careful, if I failed to understand the warning in time, the entity would not hesitate to extend its grasp to someone new, someone it had already marked. The house, once a place of childhood comfort, had become a prison of vigilance, and the true danger was no longer hidden. The days that followed were tense and suffused with unease. Every glance at Grandpa felt like a test. Every casual remark in the house was weighed for hidden meaning. I began to notice subtle changes in others, my own family members, that I couldn't explain. A glance that lingered too long, a hand that trembled when it shouldn't, small expressions of fear quickly masked with forced smiles. At dinner one evening, I caught my cousin's eyes flicker toward Grandpa in a way that didn't feel natural, as if she was anticipating something he would do, or perhaps that evening the weight of suspicion and fear became too heavy to bear. I found Grandpa sitting alone in the study, the flickering candlelight casting long, trembling shadows across his face. His hands trembled slightly as he held a worn photograph, and for the first time, I saw the exhaustion etched deeply into his features, the exhaustion of decades spent fighting something no one else could see. I approached cautiously. "Grandpa, what's happening? Why is everyone acting strange?" My voice trembled, betraying my fear. He looked up at me, his eyes meeting mine with a mix of sorrow and urgency. "I've tried to protect you all," he said, voice low and weary. "Every night I battle it. This entity is older than our family, older than the house itself. It thrives in the dark, in fear, and it's clever. It waits for a moment of weakness, and now I am weakening." He paused, swallowing hard, as if summoning the courage to continue. "I can keep it at bay, but only for so long. I've done it for decades, but the strain is catching up. If I falter, it will reach beyond me. It will try to find a new host, someone it can manipulate, someone close, someone you know. I felt a chill run down my spine. But what can I do? I whispered, feeling powerless. Grandpa's gaze softened, but the urgency remained. You must watch, you must learn, and you must not trust everything you see. The entity is patient, cunning. It can twist reality, and it can twist those it touches. You have to understand it before it understands you. If you do, you may have a chance to stop it, or at least survive it. For a long moment we sat in silence, the only sound the flicker of the candle and the faint creak of the house settling. I realized then that Grandpa's nightly transformations, the whispers, the shadows, the strange symbols, all of it had been a desperate effort to keep the entity contained. And now that burden was slowly passing to me. As I left the study that night, the metallic tang in the air seemed sharper, more urgent. Grandpa's plea echoed in my mind, intertwining with the whispers that haunted the corners of the house. Watch, learn, survive. I knew the coming nights would test me in ways I could not yet imagine, and that the line between reality and the entity's manipulation would grow thinner with each passing hour. That night, the tension in the house reached a breaking point. Shadows seemed to gather in the corners of my room, coalescing into shapes that shouldn't have existed. The metallic tang hung thick in the air, and the whispering had grown urgent, almost taunting. I knew somehow that the entity was aware of me, testing my resolve. Suddenly, a cold force slammed into the room, and the candle flames flickered violently, casting grotesque dancing shadows across the walls. I froze as a figure emerged from the darkness. Not entirely human, not entirely Grandpa, but a terrifying fusion of the two. Its eyes glowed with that same predatory light I had glimpsed before, and a low resonant growl filled the room, vibrating in my chest. The entity advanced and the air thickened, pressing against me as though I were drowning. My mind struggled to separate reality from hallucination. Every instinct screamed to run, but my legs were frozen. It was then that I remembered Grandpa's warning. Observe, learn, survive. I forced myself to stay still, my eyes locked on the shifting form before me. It circled me, whispering in that same ancient, guttural language, each word a dagger against my sanity. I could feel the weight of its presence probing for weakness, testing the boundaries of my fear. My vision blurred as the shadow stretched and bent, trying to engulf me, yet I held my ground, clinging to the diary's warnings, to Grandpa's lessons, to the hope that awareness could be a weapon. And then, as abruptly as it appeared, the entity recoiled, vanishing into the corners of the room, leaving behind only a lingering chill and the metallic scent that had become its signature. I collapsed to the floor, gasping, heart racing, and realized the horrifying truth. This confrontation was only a glimpse. The entity had revealed its strength, and it would not be contained so easily. By the time Grandpa found me, trembling and pale, I understood the full gravity of his nightly battle. The entity was not just a shadow in the night. It was a predator, intelligent, patient, and hungry for a new host, and now it had tasted my fear. The day after the first confrontation, I felt the weight of dread pressing heavier than ever. Sleep had become a fragile, fleeting thing, and every corner of the house seemed to hum with anticipation. I knew I had to find a way to fight back, to understand what Grandpa had been doing all these years. Returning to the study, I pored over the hidden diary once more, searching for clues. Buried among the accounts of nightly battles and warnings, I found fragments of a ritual, incomplete, cryptic, and clearly dangerous. Symbols were described in painstaking detail, along with instructions for chanting the ancient words I had heard Grandpa murmur in his sleep. Some passages hinted at objects that needed to be placed in specific patterns. Others warned of the consequences if the ritual were performed incorrectly. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the magnitude of what I held. This was not just a spell or a superstition. It was a blueprint for survival. A fragile barrier against something far older and far more cunning than any living being. Grandpa had been performing versions of it nightly, keeping the entity contained but never fully eradicating it. The ritual was a gamble, a high-stakes game of control, and any mistake could be catastrophic. I gathered the scattered papers, cross-referencing sketches and notes. Certain symbols needed to be etched in precise locations. Certain objects had to align perfectly. The diary warned that even the slightest deviation could give the entity an advantage, perhaps allowing it to breach the host, or worse, choose a new one. As I studied the fragments, a cold breeze swept through the room, carrying the metallic tang and the faint whisper of the entity's voice. I shivered, realizing it was aware that I was piecing the ritual together, that it was observing every move I made. This knowledge heightened both my fear and determination. By nightfall, I had mapped out the ritual as best as I could, ready to attempt it. But I knew the stakes were impossibly high. The entity was growing stronger, Grandpa weaker, and I was now the one who would have to confront it head-on. Failure wasn't just personal. It could doom the entire household, perhaps even grant the entity a new host to extend its reach. That night, the house seemed to wait with me, every shadow twitching, every whisper laced with menace. The ritual was no longer just a set of instructions. It was a lifeline, fragile and perilous, and the first step toward understanding, confronting, and maybe surviving the ancient evil that had haunted my family for decades. The days following the ritual discovery were tense, filled with a quiet paranoia that gnawed at my every thought. The house seemed to pulse with an awareness I couldn't shake, as if it knew what I was planning. Shadows lingered longer than they should. Whispers carried just beyond comprehension, and the metallic tang of the entity grew stronger with each passing hour. Then, subtle signs began to surface. Actions and glances from someone I had always trusted. My cousin, who had seemed concerned for Grandpa's well-being, started asking questions that felt too pointed, too knowing. She appeared unusually protective, insisting I leave certain tasks to her and watching my every movement with a sharp intensity that felt like scrutiny, not care. One evening I caught her in the hallway, holding one of the ritual fragments I had been studying. Her eyes met mine, and in that fleeting moment I glimpsed something unnatural in her expression. A flicker of awareness, almost as if the entity had whispered into her mind. The thought sent a chill through me. Had the entity already begun to influence her? Had it found a foothold in someone I trusted? Grandpa's usually steady presence seemed tense, almost resigned, and when I asked him about it, he only shook his head slowly. "Some betrayals are not chosen but forced," he murmured. His voice carried a weight I had never heard before, a quiet warning that the enemy could be closer than I realized. As the days passed, small disturbances escalated. Objects subtly shifted when she was alone in a room. Her words occasionally echoed phrases I had seen in the diary, phrases that should have been inaccessible to anyone else. Every interaction became a tightrope walk. Every smile and gesture felt potentially dangerous. The horrifying truth settled over me. The entity's reach was not limited to Grandpa or the house. It could twist loyalty, manipulate intentions, and turn even the closest family member into an instrument of its will. Trust was a fragile illusion, and the longer I stayed, the more impossible it became to know who was still free and who had already succumbed. By the time night fell, I understood that the real danger was not just the entity itself, but the betrayal it could weave from within, the way it could silently unravel the bonds meant to protect us. I was no longer just fighting shadows and whispers. I was facing the chilling possibility that the enemy might already be among us. In the nights that followed, The house became a stage for the entity's growing power. Its influence no longer hid in whispers or shadows. It began to manifest in subtle but undeniable ways that made every family member's behavior unpredictable. At first, it was small things. A glance held too long, a tremor in a hand, a fleeting smirk that didn't belong. But soon the changes became undeniable. My cousin, once cautious and caring, now spoke in phrases that sounded eerily rehearsed, echoing the strange language Grandpa had murmured in his sleep. Her movements carried a rigidity, a precision that was unnatural, almost as if she were being guided by an invisible puppeteer. Even other family members began to act strangely. My aunt, who had always been cheerful, would freeze mid-sentence, staring at empty corners with wide, unblinking eyes. My younger cousin refused to enter certain rooms, whispering about shadows that watch. I realized with mounting horror that the entity's reach was expanding, stretching its tendrils through anyone and everyone in the house, subtly bending them to its will. Grandpa's vigilance was more apparent than ever. Each night he moved carefully through the house, performing the rituals with meticulous precision. But the strain was obvious. His hands shook, his voice trembled, and his eyes held a haunted look that spoke of decades spent in an unending war. Even he could only do so much. The entity's growing influence was a force he could barely restrain. I felt a deepening fear. If the entity could manipulate people so subtly, I could not trust my own perceptions. Every word, every gesture, every movement was suspect. The house had become a battlefield of shadows and influence, where reality itself seemed mutable, bending to the will of a force older and more cunning than any of us could fully comprehend. By the end of the night, the metallic tang hung heavier in the air, and the whispers had multiplied, echoing from every corner, every wall, every shadow. The entity was no longer content to merely observe. It was shaping the very world around us, testing boundaries, and preparing for something far larger than I was ready to face. The house had grown oppressive, the air thick with tension, and the metallic tang of the entity's presence. Every creak, every whisper, every flicker of shadow reminded me that time was slipping away. Grandpa was weaker than ever, his nightly rituals leaving him exhausted, and the entity's influence was spreading faster, infecting subtle cracks in our defenses. I pored over the diary and ritual fragments, piecing together the instructions as quickly as possible. Every detail mattered. A misplaced symbol, a mispronounced chant, a wrong placement of an object could turn the ritual from protection into a death sentence. My hands trembled as I drew the symbols on the floor, tracing intricate patterns with precise care, all while the house seemed to pulse around me. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the shutters and carrying distant, almost human-like whispers. Inside, shadows stretched and writhed as if aware of my movements. The entity was testing me, pushing, probing, gauging my resolve, and I knew that if I faltered, it would exploit the tiniest hesitation. Grandpa hovered nearby, his eyes filled with exhaustion and trust, guiding me quietly. "Steady," he whispered. "Focus on the pattern, focus on the words. It can sense fear. Never let it see that." As I began the chanting, the temperature dropped sharply and the shadows converged, forming shapes that threatened to overwhelm my senses. I heard voices, distorted, layered, echoing the ancient language from the diary. My heart raced, my vision blurred, but I pressed on, reciting the words with every ounce of concentration I could summon. Minutes felt like hours. The house shook subtly. Objects rattled and a presence pressed against my mind, attempting to break my concentration. But I could feel the ritual taking hold. A fragile barrier strengthening, pushing back the entity inch by inch. By the time dawn's first light crept through the windows, the house had fallen silent. The oppressive weight lifted slightly and the shadows retreated to the corners. I was drained, every muscle trembling, but a small victory had been won. The entity's advance had been slowed, at least for now. Yet deep inside, I knew the battle was far from over. Time was slipping away, Grandpa was failing, and the entity was patient. It would not stop until it had found a host or broken our defenses entirely. The race against time was only beginning, and every moment mattered. The morning after the ritual, a fragile calm settled over the house. The oppressive shadows had receded, and Grandpa's exhaustion seemed momentarily eased. But beneath the surface, a horrifying truth was waiting to reveal itself. As I moved through the hallway, I noticed subtle differences in my cousin, the one I had begun to suspect. Her movements were still precise, but now there was a faint hesitance in her eyes, as if a part of her were struggling against something within. I followed her quietly, heart pounding, until I saw her enter a room I rarely used. One filled with old trunks and forgotten family heirlooms. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with the metallic tang that had haunted every dark corner of the house. And then I saw it. The entity, fully manifesting but not in Grandpa's body. Its form twisted and writhed, coalescing around someone I would never have suspected. Someone I had trusted completely. The horror hit me like a physical blow. The entity had already chosen a new host. It wasn't my cousin, not exactly. It had taken hold of Grandpa's long-lost twin brother, a figure I had only known through old photographs and whispered family stories. Somehow he had returned, hidden for decades, and the entity had seized the opportunity to inhabit him. The recognition of his face, twisted with inhuman malice, made my stomach churn. I stumbled back, heart racing, realizing that the enemy was no longer contained. Grandpa's warnings, the rituals, the diary, they had all prepared me for this moment. Yet nothing could have readied me for the sight of the entity fully unleashed, inhabiting someone I thought was gone from our world. The entity's voice filled the room, layered and mocking, echoing with familiarity. It taunted, tested, and reached toward me in ways that blurred the line between mental manipulation and physical threat. I realized the stakes had escalated beyond anything I had imagined. This was no longer just about protecting Grandpa or the house. The entity had found a new anchor in our world, and every step I took could either save or doom us all. As I fled the room, the metallic tang thickened my lungs. A chilling understanding settled in. The battle was not just about strength or courage. It was about knowledge, vigilance, and confronting horrors that could twist the closest bonds of family into instruments of darkness. The true horror had only just begun. The days after the shocking revelation were a blur of tension and cautious vigilance. Grandpa and I worked tirelessly, reinforcing the rituals, studying the diary, and trying to understand the extent of the entity's influence. But a gnawing dread lingered, the sense that the battle we fought was only a temporary reprieve. One night, after completing the ritual as carefully as possible, I noticed something unsettling in my own reflection. In the mirror, my eyes flickered with an unfamiliar glint, a shadow of something ancient and cunning that had never been mine. A creeping realization struck me. Had the entity already touched me, weaving fragments of its influence into my mind and memories? The house, the diary, the warnings, all of it might have been shaping me, preparing me to inherit its burden. Grandpa watched me closely, his eyes filled with both relief and sorrow. "You've done well," he said softly, "but remember, sometimes the cage holds more than just the prisoner. Sometimes it shapes the next one." As dawn broke, the house seemed calm, the shadows retreating, the whispers quiet. The entity had been contained once again, at least temporarily. Grandpa smiled, genuinely this time, but it was tinged with something I couldn't name. The melancholy of a man who had spent a lifetime fighting an endless battle. Yet the lingering question gnawed at me. Was Grandpa ever truly himself? Or had he always been the cage for something far darker? His warmth and stories a mask for a decades-long struggle against a force too ancient to fully comprehend. And if the entity had already touched me, were my memories truly my own or fragments of past battles I had never lived? I left the house that morning, carrying both relief and unease. The shadows would remain, the whispers would return, and the entity would wait patiently for the next weakness, the next opportunity. Grandpa's life had been a fortress, but the cost of that fortress, the uncertainty of what was human and what was not, would haunt me forever. The story ended in calm, but the final truth remained unresolved. In a battle against something eternal, survival was temporary and trust, even in oneself, was the ultimate gamble. The house was safe for now, but the darkness was patient and the question lingered. Had we truly won or merely postponed the inevitable?